This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Many migrants heading to the southern border are seeking asylum. Coming up, we look at the history behind helping asylees and examine what has changed in recent years. We'll also hear the story of a local family caught up in the U.S. immigration system. Samir Mahmood is an American citizen, but his parents aren't. And in the last year, they've had to talk about the chance one or both of them could be deported. We'll talk with Samir about the uncertainties and what's next for his family. That's coming up. First, large-scale immigration raids were expected in major U.S. cities this weekend. President Trump had promised to deport millions of people living in the country illegally, with immigration authorities known as ICE focusing on families who entered the country recently and who have deportation orders. But there are widespread reports those raids didn't materialize. For more, joining us by phone is Abigail Housloner, who's a national reporter at the Washington Post, focusing on immigrant communities in America. Abigail, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So what exactly happened on Sunday?
Well, not a whole lot. The whole country, immigrant communities and lawyers and activists in some major cities across the country had really braced themselves for these anticipated ICE raids. People had been preparing for days, practicing, to make sure they knew what to do in case they were arrested. And then nothing really materialized.
Now, here in Connecticut, leaders in our major cities, Bridgeport, Hartford, New Haven, were focused on helping those who were fearful, even though Connecticut cities weren't on the list, so to speak. So who was being targeted? What cities specifically?
Well, ICE never confirmed exactly what cities, but as we understood it from previous plans that had kind of leaked out, the cities where they were likely to go after families were Baltimore, Denver, Houston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York City, Miami, and New Orleans. Although, because of the hurricane that sort of made landfall over the weekend, there was talk that New Orleans would be avoided because under ICE policy, technically they are not supposed to be conducting enforcement operations during natural disasters.
So you mentioned major cities in the U.S., New York City being one of them. There are reports that ICE agents did show up in a couple of neighborhoods and no arrests happened because people weren't answering the door. And that was all part of some of the education that those who are undocumented living in communities, that's what they heard from even New York City Mayor de Blasio's office.
That's right. De Blasio and several other mayors across the country, the mayor of Chicago, for one, Atlanta, Los Angeles, I believe, San Francisco. This was a refrain being echoed by, liberal mayors in some of these cities, police chiefs, and also, of course, activists and immigration attorneys. There was a widespread effort beforehand, after the president sort of telegraphed that these raids were going to be happening. There was a widespread effort by activist groups to really educate people about their rights. And one of those rights is that you actually don't have to open the door for ICE agents who are bearing their typical warrant for an ICE arrest, and that's because it's not a criminal warrant. Activists say that ICE agents often try to deceive the people whose homes they're trying to enter, but technically they do not have the ability to force their way into someone's home unless they have a criminal warrant. And so immigrants being targeted by ICE for deportation have a right to decline to answer the door, and that's one of the key things that lawyers and activists were trying to get out there. And now in New York, as you mentioned, we heard from city officials that there were ICE agents spotted in a couple of places on Saturday night in Harlem, in Manhattan, and also in a neighborhood of Brooklyn, and that they were knocking on doors in an area that's predominantly immigrants, but that their door knocking didn't really yield anything. And we don't know now if this was part of the planned, mass arrest operation, or if this was just part of ICE's everyday activities. Because, it's important to keep in mind that ICE, as part of its normal operations, does conduct enforcement activities in which they go after people who have been ordered deported from the country, and they make those arrests and try to have them deported.
Abigail Hauslahner is on the phone with me. She's a national immigration reporter for The Washington Post. You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live as we reflect on these, what was supposed to be widespread immigration raids that President Trump had announced would happen on Sunday. Those did not materialize. We're getting a listener tweet, Abigail. The listener writes, "They'll still happen, and they should absolutely happen, but you don't warn your targets. You're coming for them ahead of time. You do it when they least expect you." How unusual was it for President Trump to, announce this, and what does ICE think about that?
Well, for President Trump, it's not unusual, but in general, pertaining to such operations, it absolutely is unusual. And we've heard from members of the administration privately, from people in ICE privately, and certainly from past retired officials publicly, that this is a big no-no. You generally, in law enforcement actions, do not announce the law enforcement action and the time and date that it's going to take place, because obviously, if there are certain people who you're targeting, this, gives them a heads up, and, law enforcement officers will say that the element of surprise in a law enforcement raid or arrest is, pretty key if you're trying to ensure that the person you're going after, remains in the place where you think they are or where you expect them to be. Now, the president has made this announcement now a couple of times. On Friday, it was just the latest time that he said that these big raids are going to happen. He had actually, the government has been teasing this operation for, weeks. Back in the middle of June, the president said, we're going to do this big operation. We're going to arrest millions of people. We're going to go after families who are in the country illegally and deport them. And then, it was only after making that announcement that there was this big outcry from Democrats and activists and others. And then the president backed down, and he said, actually, we're going to postpone it to give Republicans and Democrats a chance to reach an agreement on immigration reform. But if that doesn't happen, we're going to launch this operation. And then a few weeks later, he sort of was alluding to it again, threatening it, saying it was coming soon. And then finally said, okay, it's happening Sunday. And then, lo and behold, it did not happen.
There's another consequence to announcing that these raids were going to happen, not just tipping off people who have deportation orders to stay underground, so to speak, but even the idea of the safety of these ICE agents. I'm looking at your latest story for the Washington Post, where the acting ICE director referred to an attack in Tacoma, Washington, where a man who had previously protested at a detention center returned there with a rifle and incendiary devices. Police said that officers fatally shot him.
That's right. Well, the acting director of ICE, certainly did not condemn the president, his boss, but he did say that, announcing that he wasn't going to confirm whether this operation was underway. He wasn't going to say when it was going to happen, because doing so could really endanger the lives of his officer. So if we connect the dots, he's sort of saying, well, Trump may have put his officers in danger by saying this is when it's going to happen. He was, when he referred to this attack in Tacoma, Washington, where a man tried to attack an ICE detention facility and managed to set a car on fire before it was fatally shot by police. He was the acting director tried to sort of attribute that to, the really strong criticism that ICE has gotten from some people, including lawmakers. You see people on social media who calling ICE agents Nazis and ICE detention camps, concentration camps. And his argument was, that's going so far, and that's inflaming people to take, dangerous actions like this man in Tacoma.
How does this fit into the broader picture of immigration enforcement under the Trump administration? Is the strategy to make people fearful? Will this deter migrants who are trying to come into this country? What do we know, Abigail?
By now, certainly a lot of people argue that, yes, scaring immigrants, trying to spread fear is certainly one of the big objectives here as a deterrent mechanism. The Trump administration has said, itself that, these heavy-handed tactics that it has employed in some places, such as separating children from their parents, putting lots of people into detention facilities at the border, and so on, that they hope that these things will act as deterrents, and that people will decide that, no, this is too horrible for me to go through, so I'm not going to try to make this journey up from Central America and across the border into the United States. I think I talked to some activists and lawyers yesterday who said, yeah, well, that's kind of working. People certainly in anticipation of these latest raids that, didn't yet happen, were really terrified. And there were people who were just staying indoors all weekend. That there were news reports from around the country of, predominantly immigrant neighborhoods in some of these cities that were just sort of dead quiet on Sunday as people waited for, the ICE agents who they were expecting to come.
Abigail Hauslehner, again, is a national reporter at the Washington Post. Abigail, thank you for joining us today to give us an update on, again, what was reported or announced that were to be widespread immigration raids in major cities across the U.S. That did not materialize. But as we know, ICE works every day to regularly arrest and remove immigrants who, once the judge has signed off on a deportation order. So I guess it remains to be seen what will happen this week. Thank you, Abigail, for joining us.
My pleasure.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. I wanted to get some local perspective now. In studio with me is Anelsa Diaz, who's a managing attorney for Greater Hartford Legal Aid. Anelsa, welcome to our show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you heard Abigail from the Washington Post break down for us what did and did not happen on Sunday. You represent clients, some of them who are undocumented, who come here for many different reasons. This strategy by the Trump administration, is it working? Is it effective by making people fearful that they should not be here?
People are absolutely fearful. And yes, to some degree, it is working because people are afraid to come out. They're afraid to seek help. And even when they have a legal consultation, they're told that they might have some relief available to them. Some are afraid of even putting their name in the system. They recognize and understand that by filing an application for a U visa or a vow of self-petition or whatever the case may be, if they don't have an order of removal pending, that is now alerting officials to their presence in the country, their location, and exactly what they're doing.
You mentioned a couple of different programs, including the U visa. Can you briefly describe what those are?
Sure. So the U visa is a application that is available for victims of crimes. So if someone has been here in the United States and they have been a victim of a crime, and there are enumerated list of crimes that would make the person eligible, and that person has reported the crime to law enforcement and has cooperated with the investigation of that crime, they may be eligible for a U visa application. And what that would require is for the law enforcement officials to confirm that this person, A, was a victim of a qualifying crime, and B, that they did in fact cooperate in the investigation of the crime.
How difficult is it to find the evidence to persuade an immigration judge that this person, their claims are valid? Because we, again, hear often from the administration that a lot of these claims are, quote, bogus.
Well, certainly we don't file applications that we believe are bogus, but absolutely all the applications are reviewed with an eye towards skepticism and fraud, and that's just the way the agency works. And most of the applications that we do are through USCIS, so we file affirmative applications, but as well we help folks who are facing deportation and removal in court, and judges, they're there to find out if the person has some relief available. And in court, it's a little bit different. If you have the potential to file for something that you may be eligible for, the court may be inclined to postpone the matter and hold off on issuing orders until that application has been adjudicated. With the affirmative applications, there is a very high bar to be met in terms of evidence, more so than ever. It used to be that when you applied for humanitarian relief, the individuals who were trained to review those applications at the Vermont Service Center really took a different approach to these applications. They were more lenient with fee waivers, for example, with different forms of evidence that might be available to the victim. But we're finding more and more that different forms of evidence are being rejected, or despite submitting ample forms of evidence, we're still getting requests for additional evidence or indications that the case is going to be denied.
I mentioned you're with Greater Hartford Legal Aid. In Connecticut, there is actually a toolkit that was developed to help families where there might be some members who are undocumented. If separation happens, what happens to the children? Can you talk about how Connecticut's taken this kind of stance to help families? Because, again, ICE is out there doing their job every day, not just when President Trump announces that they may be doing raids.
That's right. So Greater Hartford Legal Aid, we developed last year something called a standby guardianship tool that allows for families who have undocumented parents to assign a designated custodian or guardian for their child who may be a U.S. citizen. So after the new administration took effect, people immediately started to recognize that people need to prepare for what could come. And so we assisted in creating some of these forms in both English and Spanish, which were then adopted by the governor's office in creating something called a family preparedness kit. And in that kit, it includes the standby guardianship materials in English and Spanish, instructions for that, in addition to just giving a lot of information to families about what to do, how to do it, how to plan ahead, how to let the proposed guardian know of your children's allergies and school schedules and things that, a lot of people maybe haven't given thought to before this.
You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266. We're going to be hearing about one particular family caught up in the system just after our break. David calling from Woodbury. David, we just have under a minute. Go ahead.
Oh, hello, everybody. It's just an outrage. Whatever happened to bring us your tired, your huddled masses? Well, they're here. They should have an open path to citizenship and be completely free from fear of all of this. Well, that's all I is to say right now.
Well, David, thank you for your call. Certainly there are Connecticut residents who share David's opinion. There are others who say, look, it's cut and dry. If you have legal authorization, you should be able to live here. If not, you need to go back. What would you say to them?
I would say it's not that cut and dry at all, because there are many people here who may have the ability to obtain documentation and may not be aware of it, or they're having difficulty obtaining it because they don't have an attorney, they're not aware of the system and how it works. And so there are plenty of folks here right now that could qualify and receive documentation if they only knew or had access to it.
Anelsa Diaz, managing attorney for Greater Hartford Legal Aid. She's with me in studio as we continue to look at the latest regarding immigration and enforcement in our country. Immigration reform has largely centered on the southern border and deporting migrants who enter the country without authorization. But this is just a small part in America's so-called broken immigration system. After the break, we'll talk with a young man who's an American citizen, but his parents are at risk of deportation. You can join us too, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, often detains people who have deportation orders or when a federal immigration judge rules that an individual be removed. In some cases, he or she appeals that court order and they receive a stay of removal. This happened to the mother of Quinnipiac University student Samir Mahmood last August. But today, his parents are back in immigration court to hear how their case will proceed. Samir is joining us by phone. Samir, welcome to Where We Live.
Thank you so much for having me. How are you?
I'm doing well. So tell us, before we learn a little bit about your family's backstory, what happened last year that led to your mother being very close to being deported?
So, as many immigrants, my parents came for a better life to America, and they ended up coming to New York City and then ultimately moving out to Connecticut for the future of my education. And so what happened last year is, over the last few years, they've been checking in with ICE, like a lot of immigrants do when they have cases hearing. But for some reason, ICE, my mother's case got denied, her first case. Technically, you're supposed to have about 30 days until you could appeal. We did appeal with the Board of Immigration, also known as the BIA, but ICE decided, because last year ICE was really strict on what they were doing, so last year ICE decided, you know what, let's just detain this lady and put an ankle bracelet and / GPS monitor on her, and we'll deport her in about 2 months, exactly about 5 days before your son's first day of college as a first-generation college student, and also 5 days before his 18th birthday.
Mm. So your parents came here in the 90s. They met in New York City?
Yep, they met in New York City.
And so they decided to stay. I understand that your mother's arrival to this country, she overstayed her visa, but your father had a different story?
Yeah, my father came about 7 to 8 years prior to my mother coming here. He came as a political refugee because Bangladesh, the country of origin both my parents are from, is a very corrupt / very politically broken country. My dad filed for asylum here, and now after his case got denied around 1999, but in 2011 the case got reopened, and so today, after so many years, is the final hearing for that case. And they decided to combine both my mother's case and my dad's case together.
Mm. So, again, a lot of uncertainty for you and your family. When your parents decided to move here, they made a living, as you said, to raise money that you could go to college, and you are a first-generation college student. I mean, how has this impacted, your first year in school and your families each and every day, not knowing that if they'll be able to continue to live here?
I mean, last year when the deportation order came and we were doing our hunger strike, and it was about the 24th or 23rd hour out of our 48-hour hunger strike before she had to be at JFK to be on that plane, it affected me tremendously because I was on the verge of maybe even dropping out of college, like withdrawing my registration / financial aid, because my mother's not going to be there, and I want to be where my parents are. And so there was a pact that if it's like the 47th hour and she had to be on her way to JFK, that I was going to withdraw from the university and be deported with her, even though I'm an American citizen. Mm. And so it affected me tremendously throughout the year of my first year of college. It's been a stress on me in the back of my head. My parents, there's always a deadline / countdown going on in the back of your head, even though it was a year ago and I had a year of technically quote-unquote freedom. I still had that deadline / timeline in the back of my head. I still had to meet with lawyers. I still met with politicians who were still keeping up the fight for my mother and father.
And yet you're just one family of many that are dealing with a different step in the process to have a legal authorization in this country. Under the Obama administration as well as the Trump administration, ICE often says that they're looking to go after people who have committed a crime or who are deemed dangerous. Do either of those descriptions apply to your parents, Samir?
Not at all. My mom's a middle-aged Bengali woman. She's the sweetest person you'll ever meet. She doesn't even speak English that well, but she goes by, and she doesn't even have a driver's license, so she can't even commit any crimes within vehicles or any. She doesn't even jaywalk. I'll admit to jaywalking, but she doesn't. My dad, on the other hand, has no crimes, nothing. My parents are both clean. They're both just overstayed tourist visas who just wanted a better life and wanted to flee from Bangladesh.
We have an attorney here with us in studio, Anelsa Diaz, managing attorney at Greater Hartford Legal Aid. Maybe you could clear up some confusion because unless you're in the system, it's hard to understand how it operates. If Samir's parents were to go back to Bangladesh, could they apply for some kind of authorization? Would they be able to come back in a short time frame?
Likely not. I mean, it would depend on various factors, and I can't speak to their particular case without knowing the facts and the underlying details. But certainly when folks are removed or deported from the country, it makes it extremely difficult for them to ever return. But in the event that they can return, it would take a very long time for them to be able to do so.
You can join our conversation, 860-275-7266. James is calling from New London. James, go ahead.
Hi, I was calling because you're framing the conversation a lot on the effects that the Trump administration is having on immigration, and I think what he is doing is exposing Congress for not doing something to, make the lines clearly drawn so we can get immigrants to come in legally, smoothly. And without, a lot of glitches.
Mm. And that's true. I mean, there has been inaction from Congress for decades, not just under the Trump administration. James, what would you like to see change?
I don't know the specifics. It's obviously a complicated issue. And we elect our congressmen to figure out, they should be the experts on it and be able to figure out a way to have more if we need more immigrants, they should open the borders and make the whole process smoother.
Well, James, thank you for your call. I'll go back to Anelsa Diaz. James comments that President Trump is just showing inaction by Congress. But let's talk about the people, because it's people that are affected by these policies. When he mentioned allowing, if there's the need to allow more immigrants into this country, what about the millions that are already here that have productive jobs, that have not committed any crime, that are looking for some pathway to citizenship? This is something that's been talked about for years, as I mentioned.
For years, and of course, he is correct that we are waiting for Congress to come up with some kind of immigration reform. That's been something that's been in the works for a long time now. But it's very easy to shift the blame and say, it's Congress's job to do this, and I'm not responsible as the president of the United States. Certainly, the president has the ability to shape and encourage certain actions and behaviors, and something like this, tweeting that ICE is going to be out in the community targeting families, is certainly not the kind of thing that would encourage, people to behave that way.
Samir is with us, Samir Mahmood, whose parents are going to be in immigration court later today, a merits hearing, which is to find out if their asylum case moves forward, if they can stay in this country. Samir, what's next for your family?
What's next is hopefully we win today, as the final, like you said, the merit/final hearing is today. I hope we do win, because it's been, I believe, over a 20-plus year fight. My parents are starting to get worn out by it. I'm starting to feel the side effects. I'm worried about my parents every day, waking up, seeing the tenseness of their face, like I said earlier, the countdown that's in the back of their head. We came close to last year being separated, even though the separation is not just happening at the borders, it's also happening inland, for instance, in the state of Connecticut, New York, Ohio, all the other states like that, but it just made us stronger. And so today, I hope that strength brings us, and the hopefulness of the great judge and God being on our side to hopefully rule in favor, as we're going to have hundreds of thousands of people in support of the case.
Well, Samir, thank you for telling us about your family, and we'll wait to hear what happens with your parents, but we appreciate your time today here on Where We Live.
Thank you so much.
Again, with me here in studio is Anelsa Diaz, who's a managing attorney at Greater Hartford Legal Aid. Tell us more about the clients that you serve. I mentioned that there represent people who face domestic violence or are fleeing extreme violence. I'm just curious if you could tell us more about some of the people, where they come from, and what the process has been like so far for them.
So we serve a very diverse population. Our coverage area is the Greater Hartford County, so that's approximately 22 towns and cities. And so we see a wide range of different immigrant communities that we work with, and we focus our resources on victims of both domestic violence and sexual assault. And our immigration unit currently serves those folks in humanitarian applications. So, for example, I mentioned the U visa previously. There's also the vow of self-petition, and there's other forms of relief called the T visa or asylum application, which I know you'll talk a little bit more about later. And there are also some defenses available in immigration court as well. But our office really focuses our resources, because of the limited resources that we have, on really helping those people who have been victims of crimes, including children who've been abused, abandoned, or neglected in something called special immigrant juvenile status. And we focus those resources on helping those most vulnerable people who are here, often undocumented or with some kind of mixed status, in adjusting their status.
When we hear that people are experiencing abuse or domestic violence, how are there cases where a perpetrator uses that person's immigration status against them so that they don't come forward? Absolutely.
Being an immigrant in this country, you're in a very vulnerable position. So abusers take advantage of that. They're fully aware that the person is in a vulnerable position. They threaten to call ICE on them. They threaten to have them deported and separated from their children. And that is a very, very strong threat that is very effective because, there's the fear of being removed, but even greater so is the fear of being separated from your children for a lot of our clients. That is something that, then deters them from contacting the police when they could, in fact, have the right to do that. And they're just afraid that the abuser will be correct, that the police will side with them, and that the police will not assist them because of their status.
We heard a caller mention Congress. I'm just curious in terms of our congressional delegation, are members working to help clients such as yours who are experiencing domestic violence, are looking for a type of visa that allows them to remain here out of danger?
Well, absolutely. We get a lot of support from our state and our governor and our Congress. So we recently had the legislature approve a new revision in our law that would allow children who are abused, abandoned, and neglected to apply for assistance beyond age 18, because there was something that was occurring in our state where we had a gap for children beyond 18 who were still eligible for immigration relief up until age 21. So understanding that for special immigrant juvenile status applications, the state court has to make a finding of abuse, abandonment, or neglect before the child can file with immigration. What was happening is the children who were aging out of the system in terms of our state laws were no longer able to apply for that immigration relief that may have been available to them. So we were able to petition our legislature to change that law after appealing a case from our office that went all the way up to the Connecticut Supreme Court. And the legislature heard our pleas, and they made those revisions, and now we have the ability to petition for children who are 18, 19, and 20 for those findings that will allow them to file with USCIS for special immigrant juvenile status.
Anelsa Diaz, again, is a managing attorney at Greater Hartford Legal Aid. Anelsa, thanks for coming in to explain some of the work that you and your colleagues are doing to help specific individuals living in our state.
Thank you, Lucy.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we're going to learn a little bit more about our laws that help asylees, people who are running from danger in their native countries. Historically, the country has had different strategies to deal with asylees. There have been some recent changes. We're going to learn more about that from Valeria Gomez, who is a clinical teaching fellow in the Asylum and Human Rights Clinic at UConn Law School. And you can join us, too, especially if you have a question, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We've been talking about immigration enforcement against people who don't have the legal authorization to live in the U.S., but we wanted to focus now on why people flee their native countries and historically the mechanisms that have formed over the years in the U.S. to help them. In studio with me now is Valeria Gomez, a clinical teaching fellow in the Asylum and Human Rights Clinic at UConn Law School. Valeria, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me, Lucy.
You can also join our conversation, 860-275-7266, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. People that are coming to our southern border, Valeria, many of them are trying to get legal status through asylum. So tell us again, of individuals based on our laws, who is eligible to get asylum?
So asylum is for people that have found their way into the United States or are at our ports of entry, at our border checkpoints. And it protects people who are fleeing persecution from their home countries. So specifically, it's for people that have suffered past persecution or have a well-founded fear of persecution that their government cannot or will not protect them from, and persecution that's based on their religion, their political opinion, their nationality, their race, or their membership in a particular social group, which is sort of a amorphous category.
So that description sounds a lot like someone who is technically a refugee, but the difference is an asylum seeker is already at our border or maybe even in the country?
That's correct. That's correct.
And so when we think about our laws, when did the U.S. Determine who could and could not come here, specifically where there was actually a law in place?
Sure. So our laws related to asylum and to refugee status are derived from international obligations that we have related to UN conventions protecting refugees. So in 1968, we signed on to what's referred to as the 1967 Protocol, which is essentially a law that extended refugee, or a convention, a treaty within the UN that extended refugee protection to these categories that I mentioned. In 1980, we passed the Refugee Act, which essentially was put in place to ensure that we were protecting people to the fullest extent and that we were comporting with our obligations under that treaty.
So if someone is fleeing a Central American country, as an example, why couldn't they apply to be a refugee?
So refugee status is something that you get outside of the country, but it's not necessarily like you can go into, an embassy, a U.S. embassy, or a consulate to just request refugee status. We don't necessarily have refugee camps that administer refugee claims in Central America the way that we do in these areas where we hear a lot of refugees, requesting refugee status, like perhaps a Syrian. Mm-hmm. For a while, we actually did have a system in place for Central American minors, certain qualifying Central American minors. But with the Trump administration, that program was eliminated. So we actually no longer have that capacity. And so people who are seeking protection from persecution, the way that they seek it is to actually leave their country and to go to the safest alternative that they have, which for many people is the United States.
And so the asylum seekers that we're seeing at the southern border, tell us some of the reasons why they're coming.
We're seeing people that are fleeing because, we saw a big increase in 2013 of people that started fleeing because the situation in Central American countries, particularly in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, became untenable. The government, which has been in those countries, which have been rattled from some pretty horrific and long civil wars, have been unable to control local criminal organizations that have essentially become new de facto governments and have really terrorized youth and young people. And there's also been a very tragic culture of violence against women, and this has been exacerbated by this gang culture in which, we've seen examples of very young women, young girls that have been threatened to become gang property and gang girlfriends against their will. And they're fleeing really unspeakable things. And the local governments have been unable to check this type of horror. And so that's some of the reasons that we're seeing people come. In other instances, we're seeing increases, for example, from countries like Nicaragua, where the government is really starting to really press down on opposition. And so people who are doing the exact same thing that we do here in the United States, stand up to oppressors and request things from their government, we're seeing that they're not able to do so, and they're being, persecuted for that.
Valeria Gomez is a clinical teaching fellow in the Asylum and Human Rights Clinic at UConn Law School. As we learn more about the asylum laws that have been in effect in our country, as well as why people are coming seeking asylum, I wanted to focus on in the past, if someone was seeking asylum, what were they guaranteed to get, so to speak? Was it a specific hearing before they're sent back to their country, and how has that changed?
So there are several ways to request asylum, and as Anelsa was speaking, there's the affirmative way in which you're not necessarily in removal proceedings, and you request it through an interview with the asylum office at United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. But the people that we're encountering and the stories that we're hearing from people in the southern border, these are people that are in what's called a defensive process, and these are individuals who would otherwise be subject to something that's called expedited removal. And what that essentially is, it's a summary deportation. So individuals who are encountered near the border or at a port of entry who can't show that they have the proper documents to show authorization to enter the country, they're usually just essentially immediately deported after a quick interview without a hearing in front of an immigration judge. And so in order to ensure that we're actually complying with our obligation to prevent people from returning to situations where their life and freedom would be threatened, we're supposed to ask them at the border whether or not they have a fear of returning back to their country, if they have a fear of persecution. And if they indicate that that's the case, what we do then is we refer them for what's referred to as a credible fear interview, so that an asylum officer who's trained in the laws of asylum of our country can do a very in-depth interview to try to determine whether or not it's likely that this person, if they were given time to accumulate evidence and if they were given time to prepare a case, often with legal counsel, whether they'd be able to really demonstrate that they do meet the eligibility requirements and the evidentiary burden in front of an immigration judge.
But is that happening?
Well, something that's changed recently, the Remain in Mexico policy, referred to as officially the Migrant Protection Protocols, have subverted that because essentially people are being told after they have this very cursory initial interview that they have to be in Mexico and wait for their hearing, wait for their day in court. What makes that difficult is that in Mexico they may not have access to lawyers. It's unclear to what extent U.S. lawyers are able to practice in Mexico to begin with. And in many cases, they're actually still in danger. So we may be actually not complying with our obligation to protect people from persecution because we're summarily returning people to a place where they would still be in danger. Their persecutors can still find them. There have been reports of facts that we're losing track of people who we're supposed to be bringing into court.
We're getting news from the AP. According to a new rule published in the Federal Register, asylum seekers who pass through another country first will be ineligible for asylum at the U.S. southern border. That rule is expected to go in effect tomorrow. Also applies to children who have crossed the border alone. Is this expected? Was this expected, Valeria?
Oh, I just learned about this. I have reason to believe that this new rule would have to be challenged. There is such thing as a Safe Third Country Agreement, which is a bilateral treaty that's done in between countries where it's determined that it would be safe for someone who's seeking asylum if they pass through that country first to request asylum in that country or not before being able to request it in their final destination. We only have that agreement with Canada at the moment. So to the extent that people are summarily denied asylum because they've passed through a different country, that's not really what our laws call for at the moment. So that would be going against what's in the Congress-passed statute. Apart from that, we have protections also in the statute for unaccompanied children. Unaccompanied children are afforded special protections in terms of procedure, so they don't necessarily have to go through the immigration court as a first step for their asylum claim. But beyond that, we don't return children who are not from Mexico or Canada, precisely because we want to protect them and because we're supposed to be very sensitive to risks related to human trafficking.
We might have touched on this, but there's the Remain in Mexico policy in effect now. So again, if someone has a reasonable fear of getting killed, the legal principle is to not return them to their native country. But is that actually being violated now as we speak?
It's being violated insofar as we're actually supposed to be asking whether they would also be in danger in Mexico. So there was a recent lawsuit that was filed by the Asylum Officers Union, actually, within this month, in which the asylum officers that were part of that lawsuit themselves claimed that they were being told not to ask them, okay, well, are you afraid of returning back to Mexico? And so by very technically keeping it to the question of whether or not they were afraid of returning back to their home countries, they were actually getting out of determining whether or not they would be safe in Mexico. So that it's certainly a concern because there are individuals who can just as easily or still very likely be persecuted because they're in the country of Mexico. That doesn't make them safe. And local, I think local crime organizations in Mexico are capitalizing on that. So people live in a lot of fear.
There's been a lot of attention and warranted attention on some of the conditions that these child asylum seekers have been experiencing at the border when they're put in these detention centers. I understand you used to represent some of these unaccompanied minors. What's your take on what you've seen in the last few months?
It's really heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking, particularly when you've actually then met these children and you've met these teenagers, and they're teenagers just like you and me may have been. They have this additional anxiety about whether or not they're going to have to go back to a situation where their life is in danger. But apart from that, it's individuals who are excited about school or are dreading tests or have crushes on people at school. And we have a real ability, I think, to dehumanize people who we see as others. And unfortunately, I believe that's starting to include children. That's just from the emotional perspective, but even from a legal perspective, it's really egregious because, again, we have special standards in place related both that we get from statutes, but also from a consent decree, a settlement agreement that was entered, known as the Flores Settlement Agreement, in which there was already a lawsuit in the 90s related to the conditions under which we were holding children, and we put these rules in place so that they would have to have safe and sanitary conditions, so that they would have to only be held in ICE detention facilities that aren't meant for children for a maximum of 72 hours, and then transferred to a place that was a licensed child care facility that would provide schooling, that would provide recreational services. Children are supposed to be held in the least restrictive setting for their well-being in light of the fact that they're a particularly vulnerable population and they're so subject to abuses. And not only are we not complying with that rule, but we're keeping them in really squalid, unsanitary conditions. And there's no telling what kind of damage and trauma we're causing them under the guise of following some laws that are not really necessarily being enforced correctly in the first place.
There's been a lot of outrage. Are you convinced that the administration will make some changes so that the children and others aren't kept in these kinds of conditions?
I'm hoping that this is going to happen. I think as a society, the United States is particularly sensitive to the plight of children. When family separation happened, there was an outrage as well, and there were changes in policy, at least on the official stance, regarding whether or not we were going to be enforcing certain, criminal misdemeanors so that we could keep families together. There's a whole lot to say about whether or not that happened as well, but I am hopeful that at least as it relates to the detention of children, that we'll, as a country, will be vigilant and will refuse to accept that this is what can happen, and that the government will pay attention.
Valeria Gomez, again, is a clinical teaching fellow in the Asylum and Human Rights Clinic at UConn Law School. Valeria, thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Lucy.
Today's show produced by Carmen Baskoff. Thanks to Carolyn McCusker on the phones. Kyone Wolf is our technical producer. You can learn more about the show at wnpr.org/wherewelive, or if you can't listen live, you can always download our podcast. Just search for Where We Live on your favorite podcast app. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. As always, thanks for listening.